Picture it. The clock strikes midnight. Christmas Eve, 1945. A small house in Fayetteville, West Virginia, glows faintly against the snow, its windows lit with the warmth of family. Inside, the Sodder children hang stockings, their laughter carrying into the night. And then, without warning, flames explode through the wooden structure. Within minutes, the home is swallowed whole. George and Jenny Sodder escape with 4 of their children, but 5 others never come out. 5 children, ages 5 to 14, vanish into the fire. But here's the first crack in the official story. The fire should have left bones, fragments, some trace of them. Instead, nothing. Not a single tooth, not a single bone. Just absence. Officials told the family the children had been reduced to ash, erased entirely by the blaze. But fire does not do that. Even in crematoriums, bones remain. So why did the earth swallow 5 children whole that night? Why did the flames behave like no fire ever should? And why did the local authorities rush to close the case, while whispering townsfolk suggested the Sodders had been marked, not by fate, but by something far colder? What begins as a tragedy quickly hardens into something darker. You see, the Sodder family were not ordinary. George, the father, was Italian-born and fiercely outspoken, known in Fayetteville for his strong criticisms of Mussolini and fascism. This was not a time or place where those words were taken lightly. He made enemies, powerful ones. And just weeks before the fire, strange men lingered near the Sodder home, making threats, speaking words that sounded more like warnings disguised as curses. They told George, "Your house will burn, your children will pay." And on Christmas Eve, those words became reality. But this is where the story tilts from tragedy into forbidden history. Because the Sodders never accepted the official explanation, they began to see things others missed. A telephone line cut before the fire, a ladder that vanished from its usual resting place, found discarded down a ravine, a series of sightings of the missing children, alive, carried away in cars, taken across state lines. And in every clue, one chilling truth begins to emerge. This was not a fire. This was an erasure, a calculated removal, cloaked in flames, designed to silence a family that dared to speak against forces much larger than themselves. In the weeks that followed, the Sodders stood in the ashes of what had once been their home, their grief sharpening into suspicion with every unanswered question, every official dismissal that felt more like a command to be silent than an attempt at truth. And George, a man hardened by labor and sharpened by exile, refused to bend to the convenient lie that his children had simply evaporated into smoke. He had seen enough of the world to know when power was hiding its hand, and Fayetteville itself seemed to tremble under that silence, the townsfolk whispering that the fire department arrived too late, that the coroner filed his report too fast, that the sheriff avoided their eyes. And then there were the small details, the ones investigators would prefer a family too broken to notice, the fact that the family's phone line had been deliberately cut hours before the blaze, the missing ladder George always kept propped against the side of the house, gone the night of the fire, and found later in a ditch far from where it could have been used, the man on the road tossing what looked like a block of kerosene into the yard only minutes before the flames erupted. And if all this sounds like paranoia, understand this: every detail adds weight to the scales. Every silence hides intention, because fire destroys evidence, but it also creates distraction. And when you distract a grieving family on the holiest night of the year, you cloak theft in tragedy, you cloak abduction in flames. And here is where the story becomes unbearable. Reports trickled in from strangers across the region, people swearing they saw 5 dark-eyed children matching the Sodders' description, taken into a car, spotted in a diner, glimpsed at a boarding house in Charleston, even recognized in photographs years later, always just out of reach, always dismissed by those who claim to investigate. And you must ask yourself, why would the state, the authorities, the same men who swore these children were ash, worked so diligently to close doors on every potential lead, every sighting, every possibility that the Sodders were right. Because truth here is not about fire or disappearance, it is about control, about silencing those who challenge systems larger than themselves, about a man whose refusal to bend to fascism marked his bloodline as a threat, punished not with death alone, but with a wound more permanent, the erasure of his children from his life and the mocking persistence of uncertainty. And that is the cruelest design of all, leaving you forever unsure whether your family was burned in the flames or stolen by human hands that never intended to let them go. As weeks bled into months, George and Jenny Sodder became more than grieving parents. They became enemies of the silence that tried to swallow them, spending every dollar, every ounce of energy chasing whispers of their lost children. And with each clue came another shadow, another reminder that they were being watched, pressured, and subtly warned to abandon their search. Strangers told George he was wasting his time. Officials smirked at Jenny's relentless questions. Neighbors who once offered comfort began to pull away, as if the Sodders carried a curse that could be caught simply by standing too close. Yet still the evidence grew too sharp to be ignored. Jenny wrote to crematoriums across the country, demanding answers. And every expert said the same. Even in fires far hotter and longer burning than the blaze that consumed the Sodder home, bones always remain, fragments always survive, meaning that her children's total disappearance was not only improbable, but impossible. And yet the state clung to its fiction as though it were scripture, stamping it into reports, burying the doubts beneath bureaucratic language until the very weight of authority seemed to crush anyone who dared to question. And still, George pressed on, even when his property was littered with threats, even when strangers hinted that his Italian heritage and outspoken disdain for Mussolini had marked him, that there were networks of men, hidden, organized, disciplined, who never forgave betrayal, never forgot a voice that refused obedience. And suddenly the Sodder mystery was no longer confined to Fayetteville, no longer the tragedy of one family, but a symbol of something more ancient and sinister, the way institutions bury truth, the way officials protect each other, the way silence itself becomes a weapon. And in this silence the Sodders built a billboard along Highway 16, a defiant monument that screamed to every passerby, "Our children were taken, our children live." And as that message spread across America, something shifted. The story of 5 children lost in flames turned into a whispered legend of 5 souls stolen by forces that manipulate not only men, but history itself. Forces that erase inconvenient truths, forces that remind you that the moment you challenge power, it doesn't just destroy you, it destroys what you love. It reaches into your home, your blood, your very future, and extracts it, leaving you with nothing but questions that ache louder than grief itself. By the time the second Christmas after the fire arrived, the Sodder home had been rebuilt, but the walls could not hold back the haunting absence that stalked every corner. And instead of surrendering to despair, Jenny turned her mourning into obsession, replaying every second of that night until memory became a weapon, until every inconsistency stood out like a fracture in glass. For she remembered the heavy thud on the roof hours before the flames, the sound she first dismissed as winter branches, but now realized could have been the explosive device neighbors later whispered about. A small object hurled to ignite and distract, while something far colder happened in the dark. She remembered trying to reach the telephone to call for help, only to find the line already cut, as though someone had prepared the stage long before the fire's first spark. And when George attempted to save his children with his trucks, both engines, perfectly functional the day before, refused to start, as if sabotage had already sealed the children's fate. And while the state clung to its tidy narrative, the Sodders began receiving strange letters and calls, fragments of voices that offered hope twisted into torment. One woman in Florida swore she overheard men boasting about the children. Another claimed to see them in a boarding school in New York. And always the same pattern, credible enough to sting, dismissed fast enough to close the door, leaving George and Jenny balanced between torment and resolve, caught in that cruel limbo of not knowing, yet refusing to let the silence win. So George began traveling, chasing every rumor across the country, only to be followed by men he could not name, men who watched his movements as if to remind him that the search itself was trespass. While Jenny, dressed always in black, sat at her kitchen window each night, staring at the mountains as though waiting for her children to return, and the town began to mutter that the Sodders had gone mad. But madness is the word the powerful use when truth is too dangerous to face, and what was happening here was not madness at all, it was revelation. That institutions are built not to uncover truth, but to bury it. That power will rewrite the story of your life while you are still living it, and that the Sodders' true crime was not losing their children, but daring to demand answers in a world that thrives on silence. The Sodders' determination to uncover the truth took on the shape of defiance, and while most families broken by such catastrophe would have folded inward, silent under the crushing weight of official indifference, George and Jenny began to fight back with the only weapon left to them, visibility, for they refused to let their children be reduced to ash and paperwork, refused to let the whispers of sabotage and abduction fade into rumor, and so they erected the billboard that would become legend, a towering scar on the American landscape that screamed their children's faces to every passerby, accusing not just the unknown hand that had taken them, but the very authorities who chose blindness over justice. And as the years passed, that billboard became both shrine and threat, a constant reminder to the powerful that the case would not die, and to the townsfolk that perhaps they were complicit in something unspeakable, and though the police scoffed and newspapers twisted the family into spectacle, strangers began arriving. Private investigators, journalists with too many questions, drifters carrying fragments of testimony they claimed to have overheard in bars and prisons, each one feeding the Sodders' fragile flame of hope. And yet with every new lead came a shadow, for it seemed there was always someone trailing George when he traveled, watching him with eyes that carried neither pity nor malice, but duty, as though their task was not to harm him, but to ensure he never drew too close to the truth. And it was during one such journey that George found himself warned by a man in St. Louis who whispered that the mafia had been involved, that the children had been taken as punishment for his outspoken criticism of Mussolini and fascism, and suddenly the fire that consumed his home no longer looked like an accident at all, but a stage-managed warning, a strike meant to silence him by taking what he loved most, leaving him alive to bear the wound. And though George clung to this theory with grim resolve, Jenny clung to something deeper, that her children still lived somewhere, that the faces she once kissed were out there growing older without her, waiting to return if she could only keep the world's memory from forgetting them. And so, night after night, she prayed not for death or vengeance, but for revelation, for the silence to crack open, for the truth to finally stagger into daylight. And in that longing lay the cruelest power of all, the way secrecy turns grief into fuel, feeding a fire that will never go out, burning not just in one family's heart, but in anyone who dares to see what happens when truth is stolen and replaced with silence. By the time a decade had passed, the Sodder home was rebuilt, but not in spirit, for its very walls seemed to weep with the absence of 5 voices that should have filled its halls. And though neighbors insisted the family should move on, George and Jenny refused, keeping every room alive with the ghost of possibility, setting places at the table for children who might one day walk through the door. And in doing so, they transformed their grief into a living resistance against the silence imposed on them. Yet the more they sought answers, the stranger their world became, because reports continued to trickle in, sightings of children resembling the missing Sodders in Florida, in Texas, even in New York, sometimes traveling with strangers who never gave their names, other times seen peering through the windows of passing cars as if trapped in some unspoken captivity. And while most dismissed these accounts as wishful illusions, George and Jenny gathered them with near religious devotion, pinning them beside the billboard like relics of a truth just beyond reach. And yet every lead seemed to collapse in on itself, blocked by officials who shrugged, witnesses who vanished, and investigators who suddenly grew silent, as though the very machinery of power had been engineered not to solve the disappearance, but to keep it unsolved. And so the Sodders came to inhabit a strange limbo where certainty was denied them, where their love was weaponized against them, where every shadow in the corner of their lives seemed to carry the possibility of a child's face. And though the years hardened George into a man of steel and made Jenny a figure of unyielding sorrow, they never surrendered to the version of reality they had been handed, for they believed with a faith sharper than steel that silence is not absence, that what the world tried to bury still lived. And in that belief I stood as both testimony and accusation, proof that grief can become rebellion, and that rebellion can unearth truths the world does not want touched. And thus, their story was no longer just about missing children, but about the quiet, insidious forces that feed on forgetting, forces that demand obedience through resignation, forces that will always exist as long as ordinary people are told to accept the official narrative and look away. The search for truth became a labyrinth where every door slammed shut just as George and Jenny reached for it, for when they hired private investigators, those men either disappeared without a trace or returned with stories so fractured it was clear someone had gotten to them first. And when the Sodders pressed the Fayetteville authorities to re-examine the site, they were told no evidence remained, though years later fragments of bone were found in the soil, only for experts to declare they belonged to someone much older than the missing children, deepening the riddle instead of solving it. And soon whispers began to spread that the family had crossed an invisible line years before the fire, for George, outspoken in his disdain for Mussolini and the fascist regime, had made enemies within the local Italian community, men with money, power, and connections to networks that reached far beyond West Virginia, men who could arrange for accidents, for silence, for vanishing without a trace. And the possibility that the fire was not an accident, but a carefully orchestrated abduction shrouded as tragedy began to harden into conviction for George, who suspected that his children had not perished, but had been stolen, smuggled away in the confusion of flames, hidden in plain sight by those who understood that terror and bureaucracy make the perfect camouflage. And though friends counseled him to let go, though priests urged him to trust God, George would drive hundreds of miles at the drop of a rumor, chasing every blurred photograph and every faint resemblance across state lines, returning home with nothing but Jenny's steady hand on his shoulder, both of them clinging to the belief that the truth was not lost but hidden, and that their refusal to surrender was the only weapon they had left against a world that seemed determined to erase their children from memory, a world where silence itself felt like the loudest betrayal. As the years dragged forward, the Sodder family's defiance grew into a quiet war against unseen forces, for every time George plastered the children's faces across billboards or slipped leaflets into the hands of strangers at gas stations, whispers followed him like a curse, neighbors urging him to stop before someone made sure he regretted it. And though the Fayetteville authorities dismissed his pleas as obsession, George noticed men loitering near his property, cars parked at odd hours, strangers with the kind of watchful stillness that wasn't curiosity but surveillance, as if reminding him that he had touched something forbidden. And when anonymous letters began arriving, some claiming the children were alive and well in another state, others dripping with threats that Jenny should stop digging where graves had already been dug, the line between paranoia and reality blurred, leaving the couple trapped in a world where hope itself was dangerous, where every new lead might be a lifeline or a trap, yet they pressed forward because the alternative was silence, and silence would mean complicity in whatever shadowed arrangement had stolen their family, and so their home became both shrine and fortress. Photographs of the missing children framed above the fireplace like saints of a private religion, Jenny refusing to change their beds or pack away their clothes, as if the smallest gesture of closure would betray them, while George's once booming laugh turned into a grim, exhausted growl, a man who no longer believed in the protections of law or community, but only in the power of stubborn will against the machinery of secrecy. And though friends drifted away, though even their surviving children sometimes longed to escape the weight of their parents' obsession, the Sodders stood unbroken, a family bound not just by love, but by the refusal to bow to silence. For they knew, with a kind of savage certainty, that forces far larger than a house fire had stolen their children, and that the truth would either kill them or outlive them. The more George and Jenny pressed into the shadows, the more the illusion of an accidental blaze crumbled, for when George examined the property with his own calloused hands, he noticed details that should not exist if the house had burned naturally. The fuse box that had not melted, wires cut cleanly instead of frayed. A ladder that had always leaned against the house mysteriously vanished that night, only to be found weeks later tossed into a nearby ditch, as though someone had deliberately moved it to block escape. And then came the strangest discovery of all. Small, half-burned objects in the yard that bore a sinister familiarity, blackened rubber and twisted metal like fragments of an incendiary device, leading George to suspect not random fire, but arson executed with almost military precision, a fire designed to not only consume, but to silence. And the deeper he looked, the stranger it became, for witnesses began to confess things under their breath, like the woman at a nearby motel who swore she had seen several of the children alive that very night, bundled into a car by men who spoke in foreign accents, or the bus driver who recalled hearing a thud hitting the roof of his vehicle around the same time the Sodder home caught fire, a sound that might have been a small explosive hurled to ignite the blaze. And though George carried these fragments of truth to police and FBI agents, he was met with dismissive smirks or veiled warnings that he was stirring up something best left alone, which only confirmed what his gut had screamed since the first spark touched the house. This was not a tragedy but a theft, a surgical removal of his children in the dead of night under the camouflage of fire, and perhaps, most terrifying of all, it was done not by nameless criminals but by men who operated with the confidence of protection, men who knew they would never face justice. Men whose hands were hidden inside larger powers, leaving George and Jenny to wrestle with the unbearable truth that their children had not been lost to flame, but stolen into the cold machinery of some secret design. As weeks turned into months, and the ashes of the Sodder home grew cold, George's thoughts no longer circled just around the fire itself, but around his own life, his words, and the enemies those words may have birthed. For George Sodder was no ordinary immigrant who kept his head bowed and his voice low. He was a man who spoke openly, sometimes recklessly, against Mussolini, denouncing the dictator's shadowy grip on Italy and mocking those in America who still clung to the fascist's image like some poisonous idol. And in Fayetteville, West Virginia, a small mining town brimming with immigrant communities, such words were not harmless. They cut into old loyalties, they provoked simmering tempers, and they made George a marked man among those who considered him a traitor to his heritage. And so when George recalled how, weeks before the fire, a traveling life insurance salesman had tried to pressure him into buying a policy, warning darkly that your house will go up in smoke and your children will be destroyed if he refused, George dismissed it at the time as nothing more than a bullying tactic. But now, replaying those words under the weight of his children's disappearance, he could not ignore the venom behind them, nor the possibility that they were not threats but promises, and coupled with a stranger who appeared in the weeks before the fire, a man inspecting the family's fuse box and remarking cryptically that it would cause a fire someday, George began to piece together a terrifying picture. That his political stance had invited not mere gossip or petty grudges, but deliberate retaliation, orchestrated with precision and resources that went far beyond ordinary men. And this realization gnawed at him, for it meant that his children's fate was not the result of random cruelty, but of a larger, more sinister calculus, one in which their lives were leveraged as punishment. And for George's defiance, and yet, even more disturbingly, the silence of the authorities suggested that the fire had not just been allowed to happen, but had been shielded by unseen hands, hands that reached higher than Fayetteville, higher than West Virginia, hands belonging to forces George had only begun to glimpse, forces that thrived on fear, silence, and obedience. The Sodders' grief became movement. their mourning transformed into obsession, and Fayetteville was no longer wide enough to contain their questions. So George and Jenny took their search beyond the ashes, beyond the familiar faces of neighbors who now avoided their eyes, chasing whispers that their children had been seen alive, sometimes in nearby towns, sometimes in states far away, and each rumor carried the same haunting possibility, that the fire was never meant to kill but to erase, to vanish the children into a hidden world that most people would dismiss as fantasy, if not for the fragments of evidence that refused to fade, like the woman in Charleston who claimed she had seen the children watching her from the window of a car the night of the fire, their faces pale and pressed to the glass, or the hotel clerk in Fayetteville who swore she saw 4 of the missing Sodder children checked in with 2 adults of unfamiliar accent the very next morning, their names signed in a shaky hand that seemed to tremble with fear. And though the authorities dismissed these accounts as mistaken identity, George and Jenny could not, for they knew the shape of their children's faces, the light in their eyes, the way their bodies moved, and no dismissal from uniformed men could strip that certainty from them. So they pursued every lead, every letter, every phone call, driving across state lines with photographs in their pockets and desperation in their eyes, only to return again and again to silence, to dead ends, to that unyielding wall where official investigation and real truth diverged. And with each failed journey, George grew more certain that the forces behind the fire were organized, capable of moving children as though they were cargo, of silencing witnesses, of bending the local police and fire department into quiet compliance, and Jenny, whose maternal instinct cut D, than George's fury, began to whisper in the still hours of the night that their children were not dead but hidden, perhaps trained, perhaps indoctrinated, in service of something larger, something secret, something that used fire and ash, not as destruction, but as a veil. And though such thoughts were unbearable, they clung to them because the alternative, that their children had died screaming in that house, was a truth they could not and would not allow to be real. George and Jenny's persistence became a threat to those who preferred the silence, for each time they demanded answers from officials they were met not with compassion, but with deflection, condescension, and sometimes outright hostility, as though their grief itself was an inconvenience to the neat narrative already written, that the children had burned, that nothing more could be done, that to question was to dishonor the dead. And yet George would not relent, storming the sheriff's office, writing letters to governors, even sending pleas to the FBI, only to be met with polite refusals and closed doors, a refusal so suspicious that it only deepened his certainty that there was more being hidden than revealed. And when J. Edgar Hoover himself declined to intervene, citing jurisdictional limitations, George read it not as bureaucracy, but as deliberate avoidance, a sign that whatever forces had touched their family extended far beyond Fayetteville into institutions that were supposed to protect them, and Jenny, too, in her quiet way, resisted the finality imposed on her children's fate, refusing to wear black, refusing to speak of them in the past tense, refusing even to plant flowers on the ground where the house had stood, for to her that was not a grave, but a lie. And as the years dragged on, neighbors whispered about the Sodders' stubbornness, some calling it madness, others pitying them. But George and Jenny knew something no one else seemed willing to admit, that too many things about that night were wrong, too many doors closed too quickly, too many questions answered with shrugs as though the silence had been rehearsed, and so their defiance became a mission, not just to prove their children lived, but to expose the machinery that had consumed them, the faceless hands that had struck a match and then ordered the world to look away. And each time George looked at the blackened soil where his house once stood, he swore under his breath that he would burn away the silence itself until the truth was all that remained, even if it meant dragging it from the shadows that powerful men had buried it in. By 1950, George Sodder had grown tired of knocking on closed doors and receiving nothing but silence, and so he decided that if the authorities would not help him, he would force the world to see his missing children by building something that could not be ignored. A massive billboard erected along U.S. Route 60, a stark black and white monument to grief and defiance, plastered with the children's faces, their names, their ages, and beneath them the haunting question: what was their fate? It was not just a plea, but an accusation, a public reminder that 5 young lives had vanished into smoke without proof, without remains, without explanation. And as the years passed, George kept that billboard fresh, repainting it, updating it, moving it to new roadsides so that thousands of travelers each day would stare into the wide, unblinking eyes of the Sodder children, forced to carry in their minds the mystery that officials insisted was closed. Newspapers wrote about it, radio hosts mentioned it, and what had once been a quiet tragedy confined to Fayetteville became a national wound, a story that refused to die because George refused to bury it, and Jenny, still dressed in black and still sleeping with her lamp burning, stood at his side, answering letters from strangers, fielding tips, and holding to the strange hope that somewhere one of those children, perhaps all of them, might still be alive, hidden, stolen, or waiting to be found. And though skeptics mocked them as desperate, the truth was undeniable. No bodies had ever been found, no bones, no ash, nothing. And so the billboard became not just a father's cry, but a blade cutting into the conscience of a country, daring anyone to drive past and forget that 5 children had vanished into thin air on Christmas Eve, while the world was told to accept silence as an answer. Soon after the billboard became a fixture of American highways, letters and whispers began to arrive at the Sodder home, strange sightings and chance encounters that offered fleeting hope wrapped in unbearable torment. A woman in Charleston claimed she had seen the children watching from a passing car the morning after the fire, their faces pressed to the glass as though silently begging for help. A waitress in a distant diner insisted a group of nervous children matching their description had been brought in by unknown adults, quickly hushed when they tried to speak. Another man swore he overheard strangers bragging in Italian about having taken care of the Sodder family problem. And then there was the most haunting report of all, a photograph mailed anonymously to the Sodders decades later, showing a young man with sharp features, dark eyes, and a faint resemblance to one of their missing boys, Louis, grown older but eerily familiar, with no note except a cryptic scrawl on the back suggesting he was alive and well in Kentucky. Each story carried enough detail to pierce the heart, but never enough to bring certainty. And George would drive hundreds of miles chasing rumors, knocking on doors, searching faces in crowds, always returning with nothing but exhaustion and deeper obsession, while Jenny clutched the photo and wondered aloud if fate had played the cruelest trick of all, allowing her children to live, but scattering them beyond reach. The authorities dismissed each claim as the fantasy of grieving parents, but the sheer volume of sightings, spanning years and states, created an atmosphere of haunting possibility, a shadow world where the Sodder children might be walking, speaking, growing older under different names, imprisoned in secrecy or hidden by some unknown force, and it was this gray territory between hope and horror that kept the family suspended in endless torment, never free to mourn, never allowed to forget. As years wore on and the official narrative of the fire hardened into an unshakable verdict, George's suspicion calcified into something darker, something that pointed not merely to accident or coincidence, but to the deliberate hand of men with influence, the kind who could bend police reports, silence witnesses, and erase children as if they were lines of chalk washed away by rain. He often spoke of enemies made in heated arguments, particularly his outspoken criticism of Mussolini, which in 1940s West Virginia was more dangerous than most imagined, given the immigrant networks and quiet sympathizers who resented George's fiery denunciations of the dictator. It was whispered that men who admired Mussolini took his words as insults not just to the man but to the bloodlines and loyalties they still clung to, and when combined with the mysterious insurance salesman who had threatened George that his house would burn and his children would vanish unless he silenced his rhetoric, the chain of suspicion grew too compelling to ignore. George became convinced that the fire was no accident but a kidnapping masked by flames, an act of retaliation orchestrated by people powerful enough to ensure that local officials looked the other way, powerful enough to erase evidence and turn tragedy into mystery. And with each unanswered question, the missing bodies, the cut phone line, the ladder found discarded, the unreliable fire department. He saw confirmation of a plot carried out with precision, leaving his family trapped between grief and war, with an enemy they could not name. The deeper he dug, the more he encountered closed doors, missing files, and neighbors too frightened to speak, a silence that spoke louder than words. And he began to believe that the disappearance of his children had become part of a larger machinery of secrecy, where politics, personal vendettas, and organized influence converged into a single act of violence that the world would forever dismiss as an unfortunate blaze. In the years that followed, as George and Jenny's obsession with uncovering the truth grew louder and more unrelenting, the very community that once brought food to their burned-out home and whispered prayers for their lost children began to turn its face away, weary of the constant questions, the confrontations, and most of all the towering billboard George erected along Route 16, a massive, weather-beaten structure plastered with photographs of his 5 missing children and emblazoned with accusations against the authorities who had failed them, an unyielding public challenge that cast a shadow over Fayetteville itself. Travelers passing through could not ignore it, reporters came to photograph it, and neighbors began to feel as though their quiet town had been branded with shame by one family's refusal to let silence bury them, until murmurs spread that perhaps George was unhinged, or Jenny was cursed, or that the children had simply perished in the flames, and the Sodders' unwillingness to accept it was a kind of madness infecting everyone nearby. But beneath the gossip was also fear, because the more George shouted of conspiracy, the more people remembered the threats. The strange salesman, the cut phone line, the strange man seen watching the house, and no one wished to be dragged into a feud that might still be smoldering in the shadows. So friends drifted away, invitations stopped coming, and the Sodders, once a pillar of their Italian immigrant community, became isolated figures wandering a landscape that had turned against them, clinging only to the unblinking eyes of their missing children on the roadside billboard, which to strangers looked like a desperate plea, but to townsfolk became a permanent wound, an accusation carved into the skin of the town that no one could heal, no one could ignore, and no one dared to answer. As the years crawled forward and hope refused to die, the Sodders began following leads that stretched far beyond Fayetteville, chasing whispers that seemed impossible, yet always carried just enough weight to pull them deeper into the labyrinth. Reports of children resembling the missing Sodders surfacing in distant towns, schools, even traveling carnivals, with one story claiming a girl who looked like Martha was seen in a convent in St. Louis, another that 2 of the boys were working at a farm in Florida, and still another, almost cruel in its detail, that a soldier stationed in Italy swore he had met a young man who called himself Louis and who looked exactly like George's son, only older. But each time George or Jenny pursued these rumors, spending what little money they had left on travel, telegrams, and investigators, the trail would go cold, the person would vanish, or the lead would collapse into smoke, leaving them more desperate, more convinced that a hidden hand was carefully guiding the children's lives somewhere beyond their reach, as if they had been smuggled into another existence and locked away from their parents by a conspiracy that was far more organized than a mere crime of opportunity. Yet, even in their despair, George and Jenny clung to these sightings like lifelines, because the alternative, the idea that their children had turned to ash in the blaze, was unthinkable. So they pressed onward, chasing ghosts across America, and even entertaining the idea that the children had been taken overseas into the fractured world of post-war Europe, where records could vanish and identities could be reborn, a thought both terrifying and strangely comforting, because it meant the children were alive somewhere, waiting, hidden, unreachable, but breathing all the same. It was in 1967, more than 2 decades after the fire, when Jenny opened her mailbox and discovered an envelope with no return address, postmarked from Kentucky. Inside it, a single photograph of a young man in his early 20s, his dark hair and strong features bearing an uncanny resemblance to Louis, the child who would have been the same age had he survived. But more chilling than the resemblance was the cryptic message scrawled on the back of the photo. Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, lil boys, A90132 or 35. A string of words and numbers so bizarre it felt like code, and Jenny, her hands trembling as she showed George, felt a spark of certainty ignite in her heart, certain this was proof her son had not perished, that he was alive somewhere under another name, another life, perhaps held or hidden by people powerful enough to keep him from reaching home. And though the family quickly hired another investigator to pursue the lead, that man vanished without a trace, taking the photo with him, leaving the Sodders with nothing but a copy and the lingering torment of questions that could never be answered, the haunting possibility that their child was still out there, aware of his roots, yet unable to return, trapped in the machinery of a secret that had swallowed their lives whole. And from that moment forward, the photograph became a shrine within the Sodder home, displayed prominently on the mantel as Jenny sat each night staring at it, her grief braided with hope, her silence filled with a mother's stubborn refusal to let death claim what she was certain still lived. As the years slipped by and the Sodder case grew colder, it began to take on a life of its own, seeping out of the confines of Fayetteville, West Virginia, and embedding itself into American folklore, whispered about in roadside diners, debated in smoky bars, dissected in true crime magazines, and passed down like a ghost story that belonged to everyone and no one, with believers pointing to the photograph, the unburned bones, the witness sightings, and the ominous threats as proof of a conspiracy that had ripped 5 children from their home, while skeptics dismissed it as the desperate delusion of grief-stricken parents unable to face the finality of death. Yet the power of the mystery refused to die. For each time the story was told, details shifted, suspicions deepened, and new theories sprouted like weeds in a forgotten graveyard. Some claimed the mafia had abducted the children after George refused to join their smuggling racket. Others insisted the children had been sold or placed into new families as part of a hidden adoption ring, and still others believed the government itself had intervened, silencing the case because the Sodders knew something they were never meant to know. And in the middle of it all, Jenny, wearing her eternal black mourning clothes, became an almost mythic figure herself, sitting in her chair beneath that photograph of the young man she believed to be Louis, her gaze unyielding, her presence a living reminder that some wounds never close, some mysteries never settle, and some families remain chained forever to the night their world turned to ash. Jenny Sodder's grief was not the kind that faded or dulled with time. It calcified into ritual, becoming both a shield and a weapon, a daily defiance against a world that demanded she surrender to closure. For every morning she rose and dressed herself in black, not for a day, not for a week, but for decades, as if her body had become a monument carved from mourning, her clothing a declaration that her children were not lost in flames, but stolen by hidden hands, and the house itself transformed under the weight of her refusal, no longer a home, but a shrine, its rooms draped in sorrow, its walls heavy with silence, and at the center, like an altar, hung that photograph of the man said to be Louis, eyes shadowed, expression caught between recognition and secrecy, while Jenny sat vigil beneath it, as though keeping watch at a grave site that never existed, her presence turning the Sodder home into a mausoleum of the living where neighbors whispered, visitors grew uneasy, and even her surviving children felt the oppressive gravity of a mother who would not release them from the shadow of absence. For in Jenny's mourning lay not just grief, but resistance, a refusal to let the fire consume the truth, a refusal to let the missing be forgotten. And though time marched forward outside, new wars, new presidents, new tragedies, inside that house, it remained December 24th, 1945, forever, frozen in the smoke and screams of that night, a haunting testament that unanswered questions can bind a family more tightly than death itself. For the surviving Sodder children, life became a strange inheritance, not of wealth or legacy, but of unanswered questions and the heavy silence of their mother's vigil. For while other families built futures from the ashes of loss, they were tethered to a night that refused to die, forced to live beneath the black veil of Jenny's mourning and the endless whispers of the fire that had stolen their siblings, so that every decision they made, marriages, careers, children, was touched by the weight of what was missing. And though they loved their mother, her relentless devotion to the mystery cast a shadow over their own identities, each child struggling with the suffocating sense that their very survival had been an accident, a cruel exchange that demanded they bear witness to her sorrow as penance for being spared. And in quiet moments, some longed to escape, to leave behind the watchful eyes of neighbors and the house that had become a tomb. Yet guilt always pulled them back. For how could they abandon the search when Jenny refused to let go, when George carried his obsession to the grave, when the photograph of the boy said to be Louis hung like an icon of unresolved faith, and so they became custodians of a wound that could never close, carrying it into adulthood like a second skin, speaking of their siblings not as memories, but as questions, living lives that were never fully theirs, as though the fire had not only taken 5 children, but fractured the survivors into pieces of a mystery that would never allow them peace, leaving them caught between loyalty to a mother's relentless vigil and a desperate yearning for freedom from the ghost of a night that time itself seemed powerless to bury. The outsiders who circled the Sodder family, detectives, neighbors, passing strangers, became both spectators and judges in a tragedy they did not bear. For while some offered sympathy, dropping off food or whispering words of pity, many more recoiled, dismissing the family's endless search as an act of madness, a refusal to accept the obvious truth of death, and in this way the Sodders were cast not as victims, but as pariahs, their grief transformed into a spectacle for others to dissect. And worse, those who had once been friends began to retreat, unable or unwilling to stand beneath the crushing shadow of Jenny's black veil, whispering that she had lost her mind, that George's obsession was poisoning the children, that the billboard was an embarrassment drawing unwanted eyes to their quiet town, so that compassion curdled into contempt, and the family became increasingly isolated, seen as clinging to delusions rather than uncovering buried truths. Even as private detectives, some well-meaning, others opportunists, chasing a fee, came and went, feeding Jenny's hope with rumors and promises that always collapsed into dust, leaving her more haunted, more fragile, yet more determined than ever. For each dismissal only hardened her conviction that the world conspired to silence her, and every time a sheriff or official shook his head, telling her to move on, she heard not reason but betrayal, as though they had already decided her children's disappearance was too inconvenient, too strange, too dangerous to explain. And thus the Sodders walked alone in a world that had lost patience with them, the line between grief and madness blurring until their search became less about finding answers and more about defying a community, a system, a silence that seemed determined to erase 5 children from the story of the earth itself. The ruins of the Sodder house became less a graveyard of bricks and ash than a living wound in the landscape, a silent witness to something unspeakable, for though the fire had reduced it to a blackened husk, the ground itself seemed to whisper with unanswered questions, the scorched earth holding its silence like a priest sworn to secrecy, and Jenny found herself drawn to it day after day, pacing the perimeter as though circling an altar, staring into the soil that had swallowed her children, yet yielded no bones, no proof, nothing but smoke and memory. And in the stillness of winter nights, she swore she could hear voices echo from the hollowed walls, faint, childlike cries carried in the wind, taunting her, daring her to give up. But she never could, because the house was not a ruin to her. It was a trap, a theater where an act had been staged and then wiped clean, and the more she stared at it, the more convinced she became that the fire was never meant to consume, but to conceal, that the house itself had become complicit, its remains standing not as evidence of disaster, but as a monument to conspiracy. And neighbors passing by would shiver, glancing quickly away, because there was something in those blackened timbers that unsettled even the most practical soul, as if the house resented being reduced to silence. as if it held a secret so heavy it warped the very air. And so Jenny returned again and again, sometimes kneeling to sift her fingers through the earth, sometimes clutching her rosary, sometimes simply staring for hours until the moon rose over the ruins, her breath fogging in the night, her grief entwined with the shadows of what remained, until the Sodder house was no longer merely a site of tragedy, but an unholy landmark, a place that refused to release what it knew. It began with whispers, carried not in newspapers or official records, but in the mouths of neighbors who claimed to have seen something, someone, shadows that should not exist. First a motorist who swore he had seen children peering from the back of a passing car on the night of the fire, their faces pressed to the glass with wide, terrified eyes. Then a woman working at a local inn who claimed 5 children matching the Sodder descriptions had arrived, with 2 men and a woman in the early hours after the blaze, shushed into silence before being hurried into a private room. And later still, years on, a school teacher in a nearby town confessed she had seen photographs of children enrolled under false names who bore a striking resemblance to the missing 5, but when asked to present them, the photos were gone, missing as if erased by an invisible hand, and so the rumors grew, taking root in the soil of Fayetteville like invasive vines, fueled by Jenny's refusal to accept death without proof, fueled by George's insistence that the world was mocking them, hiding their children in plain sight, fueled by townsfolk who wanted to believe in a mystery rather than admit helplessness, and soon every stranger in town became a suspect, every unfamiliar car a threat, every unexplained visit a sign of hidden conspirators, until the Sodder family lived in a state of perpetual half-hope, half-despair, caught between the belief that their children had perished and the suspicion that they were out there somewhere, alive but unreachable, and with every whispered rumor came a fresh torment, for hope can wound as deeply as despair. And each story, no matter how fragile, was enough to keep the fire of suspicion burning long after the ashes had cooled. The Sodders' search became less of a quest for truth and more of a life sentence, an endless pilgrimage down roads that led nowhere, yet always seemed to promise revelation just out of reach. And George, with calloused hands still stained from his work as a contractor, began traveling far beyond Fayetteville, chasing down every scrap of information, every rumor that hinted his children might still draw breath, paying private detectives who arrived full of swagger and promises, but vanished with his money and no answers, consulting psychics who claimed the children had been taken across state lines or sold into lives of secrecy, contacting the FBI, whose initial interest turned quickly to silence, a silence George felt was not neglect, but something calculated, as if the higher authorities knew far more than they dared admit. And always there was the feeling that unseen forces were moving just ahead of him, one step beyond his grasp, erasing trails, intimidating witnesses, covering tracks with the precision of an organization far larger than the confines of a small town feud or grudge, until George was no longer a man searching for his children, but a ghost himself, consumed by maps with circled towns, letters scrawled with desperate notes, photographs of strangers' children sent anonymously with the chilling suggestion that one of them might be his, and Jenny meanwhile transformed their home into a mausoleum of absence, refusing to wear black as widows did, but instead tending the children's bedrooms as though they had only stepped out for the afternoon, beds made, clothes folded, shoes polished, meals sometimes left untouched on the table as offerings, her life a shrine to the possibility of return. And thus the Sodders became prisoners of hope, chained by a possibility so cruel that it denied them the final mercy of grief, leaving them instead in the twilight realm between, in death and disappearance, a place where answers dangled just out of reach like a noose above the neck. Years passed, the house rebuilt, the family aged, but the wound never closed. And then, in the early 1960s, a letter arrived postmarked from Kentucky with no return address, containing a single black-and-white photograph of a young man in his 20s whose eyes, deep-set and burning with an uncanny familiarity, stopped Jenny's breath and sent George's hands trembling as though he held the weight of one of his lost sons returned in ghostly form. For written on the back in a scrawl was the message, "Louis Sodder, I love Brother Frankie, Lil Boys, A90132 or 35. Cryptic words that seemed less like a message than a cipher meant to taunt or mislead. Yet the resemblance to their missing boy Louis was undeniable. His strong jawline, the same arched brows, the hauntingly familiar curve of the mouth, and once more the Sodders' lives were thrown into chaos, with George packing bags, writing letters, and begging authorities to trace the photograph, only to be met again with shrugs, dismissals, and silence, the letters swallowed into files that seemed to disappear into an archive no one could access, and the photograph pinned to the family's mantel like a relic of resurrection. Jenny gazing at it daily until the eyes in the photo became both comfort and torment, proof perhaps that the children had not burned that night, but instead had been stolen into some hidden fate. Perhaps a trafficking ring, perhaps a government experiment, perhaps something darker still. And the photograph, far from bringing answers, only inflamed the endless fire of suspicion, dragging the family deeper into its labyrinth, binding them forever to a question without an answer, and Fayetteville whispered still, the townsfolk shaking their heads, some pitying, some mocking, but all knowing that the Sodders would never escape the night their house became a grave without bodies, for the photograph was not not closure, but a cruel reminder that sometimes the truth is not buried. It is hidden in plain sight, watching, waiting, daring you to chase it until your last breath. By 1969, the years of chasing shadows, traveling down dead-end roads, and knocking on doors that refused to open had finally ground George Sodder into exhaustion, his once strong frame now stooped, his eyes dulled by decades of frustration, and when he collapsed in his yard from a massive heart attack, it was almost as if the weight of unanswered questions had pressed his heart flat, leaving Jenny alone to carry the torch of obsession, which she did with an almost ritualistic devotion that unnerved even her surviving children, for she began to dress in black mourning clothes every single day, as if she were a widow not only to her husband, but to 5 children who had been neither buried nor found, and the house itself became a shrine, every photograph of the missing carefully polished and arranged, the photograph of the supposed Louis framed at the center like a saint, and she lit candles at night as though she were communing with spirits who refused to answer, and visitors described her as half present, half in another world, whispering to the portraits, asking them if they were cold, if they were hungry, if they forgave her, as though she had lost not only them, but her very grip on reality. And Fayetteville, by then weary of the story, had turned her into a figure of tragic folklore. Children dared each other to creep up to her house and peek through the windows, whispering that she talked to ghosts, while adults muttered that she had gone mad, though none dared say it to her face, for the sight of her black silhouette moving through candlelit rooms seemed to carry an aura of doom, and yet her devotion only intensified, because for Jenny, the fire had never ended. It was still burning in her mind, consuming her sleep, her waking hours, and her very body, until she too passed in 1989, her heart carrying the same weight of unfulfilled answers, and when she was finally buried, her grave felt less like a resting place than a tomb sealing away a secret that had never been spoken aloud, leaving her children to inherit not only her grief, but the legend itself, a curse that followed them like a shadow wherever they went. For the Sodder mystery had long since outgrown the family and had become something darker, something that belonged not to them, but to the collective memory of a town, and perhaps to something even older, something that had always fed on unanswered questions and half-burned bodies. When Jenny was finally lowered into the ground in 1989, her children might have hoped that her death would at last close the book on the nightmare that had haunted them since 1945. Yet instead, it seemed to breathe new life into the mystery, for the Sodder home itself, by then weathered, sagging, and scarred with years of quiet desperation, became less a residence and more a reliquary, a place where strangers came uninvited, asking to see the photographs, to touch the frame of the enigmatic Louis picture, to stand in the yard where the fire had burned, as if the property had turned into a shrine of unresolved grief, drawing in not sympathy, but a kind of morbid fascination. And the surviving Sodder children, though weary of retelling the same half-truths, could not bring themselves to turn people away, for they too were prisoners of their mother's obsession, unable to escape the thought that somewhere, out in America's vast sprawl, 5 siblings had grown up under other names, perhaps unaware of who they truly were, or worse, aware but afraid to ever come forward, and so the family maintained the site like keepers of a tomb, keeping the story alive in whispered interviews, local newspaper columns, and roadside conversations with anyone who asked. And though the world had changed, the Cold War ending, technology rising, Fayetteville itself modernizing, within the Sodder house time remained frozen, every room smelling of candle wax and old photographs, every shadow on the wall carrying the silhouettes of children who never aged, and visitors swore that the place felt charged, as though grief had seeped into the very boards, making the air heavy, the silence unbearable, until even skeptics left unsettled, convinced that whether the Sodder children had perished in the flames or not, something else, something older and darker, had chosen to nest within those walls, feeding on the soul. 80 story, refusing to let the family or the town ever forget. And so the Sodder mystery passed into folklore, not as a solved case, but as an open wound, one that continued to bleed into the present, staining everyone who dared touch it. As the years rolled into the late 20th century, the Sodder story escaped the confines of Fayetteville and began drifting into the wider bloodstream of American folklore, where journalists, amateur sleuths, and conspiracy theorists seized upon it as though it were not merely a family's tragedy, but a coded message about the nature of truth itself. And suddenly, magazines that once trafficked in ghost stories and unsolved crimes began running features on the vanished Sodder children, while radio hosts spoke in breathless tones about kidnappings tied to shadowy networks, foreign agents, or secret societies. And the tale mutated, taking on a life larger than George, Jenny, or their surviving children could have ever imagined, because people projected their own fears and suspicions onto it. Cold War paranoia framing it as espionage, UFO enthusiasts weaving it into abduction lore, religious zealots painting it as divine punishment. Until the Sodder house, already a shrine of unresolved grief, became a beacon for the curious and the obsessed, attracting strangers who believed they could crack the case by staring at the scorched earth or analyzing old family photographs with magnifying glasses. And while some of the Sodder children resented this exploitation of their pain, others quietly admitted that it felt like proof their lost siblings had not been erased, but had instead become immortal, living on in whispers, rumors, and headlines, and yet with each retelling the truth grew harder to separate from the myth, every new theory muddying the waters until the story became a hall of mirrors, every reflection distorted, every version hiding something, every path leading not to answers, but to deeper corridors of uncertainty. And in this way the Sodder fire ceased to be an isolated tragedy and transformed into a cultural riddle, a reminder that sometimes what terrifies us most is not the darkness itself, but the silence that follows it, the silence that never breaks. Even after the last of the Sodder siblings passed away, taking with them the first-hand memories of that brutal Christmas Eve and the decades of unanswered questions, the mystery refused to fade, as though the fire itself had burned something permanent into the fabric of American memory, and what should have been laid to rest with the family instead grew even more restless, turning into a story that outlived all of them, passed from grandparents to grandchildren in Fayetteville and beyond, whispered in classrooms when teachers spoke of unsolved history, and dissected endlessly in the digital age where forums, podcasts, and late-night YouTube dives keep the flames alive, each new generation convinced they are the ones who will piece it together, yet inevitably falling into the same abyss of uncertainty, because the case offers just enough evidence to haunt but never enough to resolve, a perfect breeding ground for speculation, suspicion, and the terrible human need to imagine what cannot be known. And so the Sodder mystery has achieved what so many tragedies never do. It has escaped time itself, frozen in a state where no conclusion feels final, where every theory only opens another door, where the faces of 5 children, Louise, Betty, Jenny, Martha, and Maurice, peer out not as victims of fire, but as eternal enigmas, their absence heavier than any presence could be, their silence louder than any confession, and in this way, their story continues to call to us from the shadows, not with answers, but with the unbearable weight of unending questions, forcing each person who encounters it to wrestle with a single, terrible thought. What if the truth was never meant to be found? The Sodder case is more than just a haunting local tragedy. It is a mirror held up to America's darker truths, a reminder that behind the myth of progress and prosperity lies a nation built on secrecy, silence, and unsolved wounds, where fires destroy not just homes, but evidence, where institutions shrug at the desperate pleas of ordinary citizens, and where unresolved questions are left to rot in the attic of history, resurfacing only when the brave, or the obsessed, decide to drag them into the light again. And in this way, the Sodder mystery becomes less about one family and more about the country itself, exposing how fragile justice can be when power decides to look away, how easy it is for whole communities to conspire in silence, and how loss, when it is never resolved, becomes a kind of curse passed down through generations, a ghost that refuses to leave, a story that never stops bleeding into the soil. And when we think of the Sodders staring into the flames that night, watching their world collapse while authorities dismissed their cries, we are forced to confront the unsettling possibility that America itself has been built on countless other nights just like it, fires that burned too fast, too hot, erasing truths that were never supposed to be told. And in this light, the Sodder case ceases to be an isolated enigma and instead becomes a symbol of something far larger, the way a nation hides its sins, the way communities protect secrets, and the way ordinary people are left to carry unbearable questions to their graves, all while history insists on calling it mystery, when perhaps it was conspiracy all along. Even today, long after the last Sodder passed away, the case refuses to rest, and perhaps that is its most terrifying power, its ability to haunt not only those who lived through it, but also those who encounter it decades later. For every generation that revisits the story feels the same cold sting of injustice, the same gnawing unease that comes from a riddle with too many answers and none at all. And as modern investigators, true crime seekers, and digital sleuths sift through the ashes of history with new tools, fresh databases, and sharper forensic insight, they discover not clarity, but deeper layers of confusion, because the case seems designed to resist resolution, its loose ends multiplying instead of tying up, its shadows stretching further the more light you shine upon them, until it becomes clear that the Sodder tragedy is not just an unsolved crime, but a living labyrinth, an entity that feeds on obsession, pulling in anyone who dares to chase its answers, keeping them circling through newspaper clippings, fire reports, faded photographs, and whispered rumors, as though the mystery itself had no intention of ever being solved, as though it thrives in the very act of being hunted, and so the fire burns on. Not in Fayetteville's ground, but in the minds of those who cannot stop asking what really happened that night, a fire of obsession, secrecy, and horror that ensures the Sodder children, whether dead, alive, or something in between, will never stop haunting those who dare to look too closely. So here we stand at the end of the road, staring not at answers, but at a wound that never closed. And maybe that was always the point, because the Sodder fire was never just about one family in West Virginia. It was about something larger, something buried deep in the American landscape, where power, silence, and fear intertwine, where institutions that promise justice falter when faced with forces they cannot or will not challenge, and where ordinary people are left to carry impossible questions for the rest of their lives. The Sodders became symbols of this, parents who refused to accept the neat, official version of events, who dug against the current of public opinion, who plastered billboards across highways, and place their grief on display not as weakness but as defiance. And in doing so, they force the world to acknowledge that something was rotten beneath the surface, that sometimes the fire does not just burn wood and flesh, but truth itself, leaving behind nothing but smoke and speculation. And as the decades passed, the legend of the 5 missing children grew into something mythic, something that feels less like a crime and more like a curse, a reminder that not all tragedies end, some simply change shape and echo forever. And maybe that's why people return to this story again and again, because it whispers to them in the dead of night that safety is an illusion, that the walls of our homes can betray us, that the people we trust to protect us can vanish when we need them most, and that evil, whether born of men or institutions, always hides just out of sight, waiting for us to forget, waiting for the fire to fade so it can rise again.